So I was as per normal. So I was as per normal, not quite fitting in anywhere. But I was doing my best to. Yeah, apologies for that short interruption. This is part two of part four. I was doing my best to kind of continue on as if nothing had happened, and my destiny as I saw it was just going to be exactly as it was when I was 13, 15, when I saw my future as just being I'm gonna go off and I'm gonna kind of change the world and have a load of young friends who are passionate about changing the world with me, and we're gonna do some amazing stuff in my local area. And that's gonna be my social life. That's gonna be my social life. That's gonna be my adventure, because these people will form the nucleus around me that will lead me to kind of having a social life and exploring new experiences. And of course, into university, I kind of kept that going a little bit. That was my belief. I clung to it in spite of the fact that I was now 18, 19, and by the time I got to university, 21. Some things, one thing to say actually, I kind of feel I should say now before I move on to university. There was one incident that deeply there were a number of incidents that put a deep impression on me, but this particular one. Behind our church, we got an old fireman who was a homeless guy, an ex-fireman who was a homeless guy, turned up one night, and he was quite drunk or possibly coming withdrawal from drink, struggling a bit. And we found him after a service or something. It was the church building we were in was not really an obvious church building week service, but we found him there. We went out and we said hello to him, and I got to hear his life story, and it profoundly impacted me because he had been a firefighter, a fireman, and he had a loving wife, a family, loved his job, and he ran into a burning building and got his corneas burned, the transparent front part of the eye. And it wasn't enough to legally blind him, but it was enough to impair his vision enough that he was no longer considered a viable candidate for the fire service. And so they gave him a desk job. And it sounded like it was the beginning of the end for him because he did not have the mind and inclination for a desk job. It overwhelmed him. Whether it was because he just was a physical type, more kind of like action than paperwork, and his brain just couldn't get around the paperwork or he couldn't gel with it, whatever. He did not thrive and adapt to the desk job, and he felt kind of like he'd lost his identity when he couldn't ride around on the engines anymore. I guess you need to have good driving vision to ride on the engine, maybe. That's one possible reason. So he couldn't wear contacts or specs or whatever, but had a functional level of vision for at least doing a desk job. And he struggled, didn't do well in his new role, turned to drink, started drinking too much, had a very bad impact both on his job and his relationship with his wife. Lost his job, started spending all his time at home drinking. His wife got tired of him, kicked him out of the house. Eventually, there was a divorce, and he ended up on the street. And it reminded me how very delicate human life is. We tend to talk about resilience, and I think resilience is more a myth than a reality, to be honest with you. We hold up great examples, and I think they are the exception rather than the rule. I'd like to say, oh, this aircraft pilot ended up getting cataracts, and he had to retrain, but he became a successful businessman doing other thing X, and talk about the celebrate the human resilience. But actually, there's quite a lot of people who are not resilient, and they are not flexible. They cannot adapt. And I'm sure on paper, a cornea transplant would have been seen as a waste for him because aside from not having good enough vision to drive, he was probably pretty functionally okay with his level of vision. He could apparently read with glasses, at least with glasses and assistive aids. He could get about. He was able to, potter about the kitchen and make himself a cup of tea or whatever. But because of that lack of vision, he lost his identity, he lost his job, he fell into addiction, he lost his family, he lost his house, um, all for the sake of a cornea transplant. And it kind of reminds me that we don't always remember quality of life the way we think we do. Our measuring of quality of life can be very, very limited. We kind of have a one size fits all approach. But for some people who are less resilient and they're being challenged in an area where they are less resilient, what seems like a small thing can be a massive difference to quality of life. And I kind of felt that that was something. I mean, I've never really fought in terms of medicine myself. I've always had a fairly mixed feelings about the medical profession, but it occurred to me that the kind of medicine that was really worth doing wasn't necessarily the kind where you have someone bleeding out on a operating table or you have someone who desperately needs a heart transplant. These are all good things to do, but I think what is equally as valid is the kind that makes people want to live, that makes them hold on to their dreams. The kind of medicine that can put a vision on a firefighter back who desperately wants to continue riding the fire engines is perhaps the more important kind of medicine. Um, the kind that is really more about addressing people's experiences in life and the functionality of their body rather than the continuation of their body. And that was very much my opinion that the functionality of the body was really more of a concern than the continuation of the body. And that would have a profound impact on me later on in life when I was looking at other things, particularly my career directions. Um, and I went back looking for that old man so many times because I felt like his story wasn't finished and that my part in it shouldn't be finished. I felt very strongly like that, and I would sometimes ask my mum, "Can you drive past the church? Because I wonder if that man might be slumped outside our church again." He never was. He never was. I went looking for him there many times and never found him again. I don't know what happened to him, but I did end up going to university. And this was the era where the internet was a thing. I'd had the internet for a while, but it was getting to the point where the internet could actually connect you. Facebook wasn't a thing yet, but other things were. Bullet, uh, uh, there were online forums, and I got involved in one. There were online dating, and I got involved in some of that, although my parents would never know it at the time. They certainly wouldn't have approved. Um, and then there was online chat messaging services, and that became a major area of my life. So I go to university, and I don't really have a social life. In fact, I have more of a social life online than I do at the university. I had kind of assumed, since my parents were pushing me into university, that it would include um, accommodation. I thought university and living at university were just kind of a package deal, and it wasn't even really an option. But no, my parents had always intended that I should. They basically said, "Look, we want you to go to university. You don't have any better ideas. We will pay for it, so that's your last excuse out of the way." And I thought, "Oh, if they're going to pay for it, I'll go." But of course, that didn't include accommodation. They chose a local university, which was fine with me. I didn't want to, go to a totally new area and lose all my connections. But then they were like, "Nah, we can't afford to put you in halls of residence. You'll just have to commute," which was about an hour on the train, an hour and a half on the train, something like that, including all of the public transport between the trains. So you'd have a trip on. I would basically take a trip by car, which would to the nearest train station that had on-street parking nearby. Then I would take a trip on the train, which was about 30 minutes. Then I would have another trip on the bus to the university campus, which was probably, including the walk into the campus, probably about another 30 minutes. So it could be around an hour, actually, given time waiting for the train and all. Around an hour and a half, rather, sometimes. And the last train home on that line was like 6:30, so you didn't really have that long after. The last direct train home was around 6:30, so you didn't have a long time to stay afterwards either, if you wanted to kick around in the evenings. There was an indirect train which you could do about 10:30 on that line, and any later than that, you had to go to a different train station and then get a taxi back, which would be a bit expensive. I mean, obviously less expensive than getting a taxi back all the way, but still a bit expensive. I did have to live. I mean, obviously less expensive than getting a taxi back all the way, but still a bit expensive. And I did have to get into where the parking was. If I desperately wanted to stay later on in university, I would just drive in and find on-street parking within 20 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes walk of the campus and walk in. And that was a lot faster. People talk about how public transport is so much better and all of this. It ain't a lot faster with the car and a lot more convenient and less stressful. Made a big difference having that car. Meant that I could stay late when I got a bit more confident parking in the area. But anyway, there really wasn't a social aspect to university at all because I just turned up. For starters, I turned up and enrolled in the middle of Freshers Week, which is a bit awkward. So I didn't really get involved in any of the Freshers event. The only student, which is a bit awkward. So I didn't really get involved in any of the Freshers event. The only student society I joined was the Math Society and the Christian Union. And the Christian Union was not a great society. It wasn't super welcoming. It was very holier than thou. It was very brethren, Baptisty, brethren type. You know, they would say, "Oh, we're a Christian Union for all denominations and we're welcoming of everyone." But they had a very kind of Baptisty, brethren type tone. And if you came with ideas outside of that, they kind of marginalized you a bit. And the Math Society was very inactive in the first year. I think the previous year they'd had a much more well organized committee. They'd done very boring things like organized trips to Countdown to go and see the Countdown TV show that wouldn't have appealed to me. Then they briefly had someone in who organized a handful of events that were interesting, like a Christmas party and a trip to the ice ring, but very little actually happened other than just trips out to the pub, which I just opted out of because I've never drunk and I've never been into drinking culture and I didn't see the point. And also, it was happening too late for me. There was a kind of prayer meeting, though, in our maths group. There was a maths prayer meeting because the Christian Union had organized departmental prayer meetings in many of the departments where you could have once a week a small group room would be allocated for people to pray for an hour between lectures. And I actually did make a couple of friends there, but I've got to be honest, they weren't deep, meaningful connections. I remember turning around to Lindsay once and asking her, she was one of the people I met through the prayer meeting. I said, why is it that I find myself so difficult to make connections with people? Why is it so difficult for me to make friends? And she said, could you, and I said, would you pray about that even? Because I don't know. And she came up to me like a week later or something and said, I've been praying about it seriously and sincerely. And I felt God tell me that in a sense you're like Eddie Izzard, which was the weirdest thing ever you can imagine someone putting it. Because in a sense you have all of this specialness inside of you, this talent and uniqueness that gives you something really powerful to share with others. But at the same time, it makes you completely unrelatable. I love watching Eddie Izzard. I love listening to his comedy, she would say, but I would think I would really struggle to make friends with Eddie Izzard because he's not very relatable. And that wasn't terribly helpful, but I appreciated her sincerity and that she actually tried. Being unrelatable is definitely a theme in my life, that's for sure. Um, I made a handful of friends, a PhD student, a fresher who I think my second or third year there was a fresher who seemed to have a much more dynamic social life than me in some ways. I think partly because he did live in halls of residence and had made friends that way, and ended up moving into a flat with people on the maths course later on as well, who seemed to be fairly social people. So he kind of hopscotched onto their sociability, I think, which is a good technique. Um, But me, I was still thinking that life should progress down this line that I'd seen. Just because I'd gone to university didn't mean I'd given up on this dream of having this young lifestyle as I saw it, and it was built upon kind of doing big things with other young people. Well, I just didn't know how to reach out to young people, and I wasn't even sure if I considered the people at university around me to be young people to some extent. Um, which is ironic because I think them looking at me may not have considered me to be a student age person, being now 21 when I entered. And that was kind of the level of where my thinking was at. I was unaware of perhaps a difference in the way people perceive me nowadays. But I was having regular prayer meetings on my own. Like I was having a time of prayer at lunch and praying, God, when is it going to come? When is this transition in my life going to come? I managed to make a handful of connections through the prayer meeting and the CU. And at one point, we kind of put together a kind of homeless outreach, but it only ever went out like twice or something like that. Um, it was two girls and one guy and me. And the guy only came once. So the one time it was two girls and me, they completely freaked out because we found this one homeless guy who was clearly struggling with some mental health issues. And I dare say he meant well, but we basically took him to McDonald's and fed him and kind of talked to him about his life, which had clearly been very hard. He was probably a young man in his early 20s, and he turns to one of these girls and says, will you marry me? I'd love to marry you, or something of that sort. And these two girls sort of freak out and freeze, and they make excuses, but even I can tell that this is, you know, they're freaked out and they're retreating because they need time to figure out how they're going to, to calm down and figure out what they're going to do. But I think they'll be, I'm thinking, oh, after 5 minutes, they'll have talked it through, they'll have calmed down, they'll get a handle on themselves, and they'll come back out and help me witness to this young man. Um, 10 minutes later, they're not here, they're not coming back. So I text them like, "Is he gone yet?" Is what we can't cope. Is he gone yet? So I kind of finish up. I close. I pray for this young man. I ask him, where he's going. I say, I don't think those two are coming back. I think they've had to go somewhere or something like that. And he goes, and they come out the loo, and just like they're totally freaked out. God bless their souls. They're totally freaked out. And I remember one of them was called Ruth, and I remember kneeling down and saying, "Ruth, Ruth, will you marry me?" Now it's actually a second proposal in a day. And she took that with good grace, actually. She took that with good grace. Oh dear. So for the first 2 years of university, I really didn't have much of a social life, but I did have one online, kind of. I I used to hang around on forums, and I made friends with people through AIM, who I met on online forums. Some of whom I spoke to, I was chatting to regularly for like 9 years. There was one girl in America. She must have been 9 years something. Went to the same anime-related forum I did. Uh, I mean, anime and manga, really. But she just left because this was the era that we lived in at the time. She just left her instant messenger details on her profile, and I just sent her a message saying, "Look, we've had some really interesting chats on the forum. I hope this isn't out of line, but I thought you might like to continue the chats over instant message because clearly we have a lot to talk about. We have a lot of common interests." And we just end up having long conversations over instant message for ages. It's really great. I feel like I do have friends. I have interesting things to talk to people about. And that's kind of like the first taste I have, really, of having kind of, I mean, she was a non-Christian, so non-Christian friends who have interesting and diverse perspectives in the outside world. And I have interesting arguments about philosophical and societal and technological kind of things. And respectful conversations, because people could actually have debates back then without having to accuse each other and throw mud online. It was a different age. Um, so that was a thing. And of course, there was this girl I met on a dating website, and I had a long kind of on-off friendship with her. I mean, initially I was kind of looking for more than a friendship. That was why I was on an online dating site, but it was one of those that was kind of much more oriented to getting to chatting to people quickly rather than spending ages swiping. Swiping wasn't a thing yet. Um, but we changed instant messenger details and Skype details, and we had like fantastic chats. We had loads in common. But neither of them were Christians, and so obviously was that aspect that was kind of lacking. But then I met this girl. She was, well, meeting her online was a complete and utter accident. I got asked to teach my brother how to code because he had to learn for his course. And my parents were convinced he was going to fail his course, which he very nearly did. And I had to teach him how to code in Macromedia Director Flash or something like that, as it was then. It was something Flash, and I had to teach him to code ActionScript. And I tried, and that meant, of course, because it was on his computer, I had to be using his computer to teach myself ActionScript. I didn't know how to do it. They said, "Here's money for a book, learn how to do this, then teach him how to do it." And so I was practicing on his computer quite regularly, learning way more than he ever did. I could persuade him to do so little. He was so resistant to learning any of it. I taught him basically how to make a button jump to a different frame. And with that, he was able to make like a picture book that he could go through. That was enough to get him a bare pass in his project. But because of that, he had his computer set up it so that it was screen, like messages. And of course, I didn't want people to kind of randomly send messages that would pop up on the screen and say embarrassing things. So, I don't want someone to say, "Oh yes, James, I need you to know that I desperately need you to know that I profess my undying love to you." And like, I don't want to see that. I just need to. It's only fair to let people know they're not speaking to my brother; they're speaking to me. So a chat pops up on the screen, and I'm like, click in and like, sorry, James is away from his computer at the moment. I'm using it to do something. You should probably hold off any kind of deeply personal conversations. But this girl is like, oh, you're James's brother. Lovely to meet you. Blah, blah, blah. It's okay. Why don't you talk to me for a bit? And so I like, all right, then, I guess as long as she knows she's talking to me and not my brother. So I speak to her for like 5, 10 minutes. And like, this has been a really fun conversation. Can I have your details so I can add you to my chat thing? And so I do. And later on that evening, we spend a couple of hours talking until my brother walks in absolutely livid and says, "You've stolen my friend." So that did become a point of drama later on. Um, but it was probably this truly life changing friendship for me. I thought it was going to be a life changing friendship for the better because here was this Christian girl, 17 going on 18, who was deeply religious, very committed, and yet also living a lifestyle that was borderline hedonistic. And she had had a wild life full of sex and drugs and rock and roll, metaphorically, and in some cases, literally speaking. Um, she'd cohabited with her boyfriend briefly during sixth form, which her mother had apparently been fine with. Um, she kind of had a long string of physical relationships. She had like, she was very hypersexual, very teasing, very open, and at the same time wrestling with it herself because she kind of felt that she shouldn't be doing this with her faith at the same time. So she was kind of at this point where she was trying to reconcile her somewhat hedonistic lifestyle with her own personal faith. Where I was starting to realize that actually I'd had such a very sheltered and insular life because of my faith. Um, and it kind of felt like we might be almost a solution to each other's problems to some extent, that she could open up, she could be a window to that kind of world of people who are just around 18 and are still living kind of the twilight of their youthful school years, and at the same time um, are ready for all of the adult things that come afterwards. Um, and to the world of risk taking and adventure that I kind of always wanted to jump into, but probably not knowing exactly what shape it would take. And I, for my part, was kind of this good influence, I guess, that she kind of really needed and benefited from. And for a long time, there was a really positive relationship, and it really made a lot of sense for us to hang out together. But it was an online kind of friendship, even though she lived locally. And it was super, super intense as a friendship. And I think everyone assumed that either she or I wanted it to become sexual. And it really wasn't quite like that. I didn't view her as I didn't I wasn't planning on her being a romantic partner, and I didn't necessarily think that's how things were going to progress. But rather I felt like I had found my best friend. And through this best friend, I would kind of piggyback into a whole new world that I'd kind of missed the first time around. And for her part, she would kind of have this new support to help her find her way through life that she maybe never had before. So I fully expected this friendship to kind of become a in-person physical thing, like come to my party, come out clubbing with me. I want to introduce you to my friends, some of whom might be interested in you, or something like that. But that never happened. And in part, the reason it never happened, at least one of the reasons, was that my brother again stuck his oar in. He was deeply upset about me having this friend who was also a friend of his. He felt like I was encroaching in his world. And like, dude, you don't have a monopoly on hedonism, and you certainly don't have a monopoly on hanging out with younger people. Although Jane, he would have been about the same age actually. Um, you don't have a monopoly on people, period. But he threw a strop and basically turned around and said to this friend, "You can't be friends with both of us. You need to pick me or him. And if you pick him, I'm going to cut you out and I'm not going to have anything to do with you. You're not going to see me again. I'm going to avoid you." And she had a crush on him. So she chose him. And that broke me. And the irony is, he ended up doing that anyway and still blocking her. And she kind of made contact with me again months later. But at that point, everything had changed. And I'd gone into a deep depression. Because you see, shortly after this happened, we went on holiday. This is probably, I don't know if it was the last holiday we went on as a family together, but it was one of the last. It was one of the last. And everything was different. And it wasn't just that I was quarreling with my brother. To be honest, that wasn't necessarily that peculiar, although this was clearly more serious than anything that had happened before. I'd been kind of experiencing a certain degree of dysphoria for a while, particularly around my kind of face and facial hair. I've been pulling out strands of facial hair whenever they grew with tweezers because I felt it made me look old and because it looked scruffy and nasty and I didn't like it and it was different. And I remember going to this kind of holiday seaside town with my parents, probably the age of 22, something like that, and wandering around and feeling like everything was different. It wasn't just that I'd lost this friend, just everything was different. Everything felt distant and disconnected and that was a seaside resort we'd visited year after year after year. We hadn't been the last few years, but we'd been year after year after year for a long. We hadn't been the last few years, but we'd been year after year after year for a long time. And I kind of had all of these childhood memories, these precious childhood memories in this place. And now somehow something felt deeply different and deeply wrong. And I remember walking up and down the promenade. It was Weymouth, actually. It was Weymouth. Walking up and down the promenade and kind of making eye contact sometimes with the other young people. And by young people, I mean kind of like teenagers on holiday, and feeling like I was getting weird looks. And I'm pretty dense being autistic. They figured out I was autistic at university. That's another story, and we'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, but let's take that detour. They'd figured out that I was autistic at university. I'd brought it up. Um, I had or would bring it up as being something that had been suggested to me, and they agreed that I should get a diagnosis, but they weren't able to pay for it. I did get some free counseling, but I didn't get a diagnosis because at that time there was no money for it. Mm. But they were willing to include me in the autistic program anyway, except they didn't have an autistic program. They were planning to set one up and nothing ever materialized. So I'm walking around Weymouth and these young people are giving me looks like, why are you smiling at me? Kind of thing. And suddenly I realize I was old. By their definition, the definition of a teenage lad on holiday, definition, I was old. Too old. Too old. And that broke me because that meant that all of my dreams and aspirations and my feelings of like what my destiny was supposed to be was now broken and behind me. But this was impossible. All of my aspirations to be this person who found his identity, this identity that I built for myself as a young person who was dynamically changing the world and whose connection to other people was kind of driven by and facilitated by whose connection to other young people and exploring the experience of being a young person was driven by and connected through that kind of need, that kind of passion to change a world for God and to make a better world and make a better place. That kind of zealotry to really see the world change for the better. Because even if that could still happen on some level, it wouldn't be with young people because they wouldn't see me as a peer anymore. And at the same time, I'd just been through all of these horrible experiences where I've just seen people die whenever I pray for them. And every time I reach out to try and make the world a better place, it always seems to fall apart. And I wasn't sure the passion was in me anymore to do it. It broke me. And I literally fell apart and became suicidal. I mean, it was really, really bad. At some points, literally suicidal. I took that counseling the university offered for a reason. Um, and I'll go into detail about what happened next and how I dealt with it all and everything later, but I literally became suicidal and super depressed. My good grades at university started slipping, my attendance started slipping, I started sleeping in mornings, just missing loads of lectures, particularly anything early mornings. I just couldn't motivate myself to get out of bed and face the world because to me it felt like life as I knew it had ended. You know, if I couldn't trust God to look after this part of my life and to bring this promise through to fruition, and to not let my youth be wasted, then how could I trust God to bring me through to a place where I could change the world anyway? You know, I was deeply, deeply shaken, and everything changed. Everything changed.